William the Conqueror is widely known to have been the illegitimate son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy. In light of the earth-shattering Norman conquest of England in 1066, much has been made of the circumstances of William's birth. Was this Norman upstart, who took England by force, even the rightful Duke of Normandy? Over the centuries, William's detractors have delighted in pointing out that he was supposedly born on the wrong side of the sheets. But how accurate is this idea? Today, on Real Crusades History, we will explore this question. William was born in either 1027 or 1028. His father was the Duke of Normandy, Robert the Magnificent. His mother was Herleva, a Norman maiden of obscure origins. Herleva most likely sprang from the ministerial class, the urban bourgeoisie from which the Norman dukes traditionally recruited their lesser court servants. Tradition holds that Robert was deeply attached to Herleva, and that the two enjoyed a close relationship. One fanciful story describes Herleva, after lying with the Duke, dreaming of a tree that sprang from her body and covered the whole of Normandy. However, Robert and Herleva were never married according to the rules of the Christian Church. Today, people wonder at this illegitimate son becoming not only Duke of Normandy, but King of England. But how did the Normans of the mid-11th century, William's contemporaries, view the relationship between his parents? How was William himself viewed by his own society? Did the Normans consider William's birth to be socially disadvantaged? The 11th century was an age of great change. The centuries-long integration of Roman, pagan, and Christian heritage into the civilization of Christendom was reaching its apogee. The Normans themselves were latecomers to this process, having recently been pagan Vikings. Increasingly, they were conforming themselves to church law, and yet many old traditions persisted. The Historia Normanorum, written in the late 10th, early 11th century by Dudo of St. Quentin, contains a highly revealing eulogy on Christian marriage. The language shows that the Normans were determined to portray themselves as models of Christian legitimacy. For the Normans, Christian marriage was now clearly the ideal, and yet the keeping of concubines endured. William's great-grandfather famously married Gunnar after having kept her as a concubine. The Burgundian monk and chronicler, Ralph Glaber, reveals much about William's early status. He tells us that while Duke Robert had no son born of a Christian marriage, it was a long-standing custom of the Normans to take their rulers from among the sons of their chieftains' concubines. Ralph, as a churchman, expresses his personal distress at this idea, but he also points out that, according to the standards of the Norman warrior elite, William should be considered Duke Robert's legitimate son, who could legally succeed his father. So while the Normans, in theory, had adopted the church's view of marriage, in practical terms, they still at times operated via older methods. William's very name is indicative of his status. The naming of noble children was not a random affair in the medieval era. A high-ranking family drew upon a collection of names to indicate status, and William's name was certainly among the ducal stock. Historian David Bates says that any notion of William having a socially disadvantaged childhood because of the circumstances of his birth is a total myth. It was only later, long after William's death, that his so-called illegitimacy became magnified. Had Duke Robert in fact contracted a Christian marriage with some high-born noble lady, surely any sons born to that union would have taken precedence over William. Indeed, Robert may very well have ultimately entered into such a marriage, had he not died so early in his reign while making a pilgrimage. Another possibility is that Robert might have married Herleva herself, just as his ancestor Duke Richard had married his concubine Gunnar. However, the fact that Robert the Magnificent ultimately died unwed produced no crisis of legitimacy, as it would have only a few decades later. David Bates also says that to normalize William's parentage and beginnings in this way is not to say that they did not affect his personality and his behavior, or how he was viewed by others. It is actually very clear that they did have a considerable effect, but not necessarily in ways that disadvantaged him politically and socially. Thus, we have to be careful when discussing the circumstances of William's birth to take into account the complex tensions influencing the norms of his era. We shouldn't assume that modern concepts of legitimacy held the same meaning for the 11th century Norman elite